Hey guys, it's Mad Static. The new year officially started like a few weeks ago, but I never got around to celebrating what a great year 2022 was. With 2023 ahead of us, I figured now would be a great time to look back on 2022 by talking about my favorite game of 2021. I could do that for 2022, but bro, I'm not making no more videos on Elden Ring. The game had a chokehold on my life for like half a year, and I will never get into an addiction like that again. For another few months at least. Speaking about mental recovery though, Pyschonauts is kinda all about that. In Pyschonauts you play as Rasputin Aquado, a psychic kid aiming to become a Psycho-Knight, which are basically psychic super agents. In the first game, Rasputin runs away from his circus family to a junior psychic training camp, so he can train to become a Psycho-Knight. But while there, he discovers a psychotic plot by a psychopathic dentist to steal the campers' brains and use them to power psychic tanks, which is bad, so he's gotta put a stop to that. It's a good setup for a fun, family-friendly adventure, which it is, but what you have beyond that is some of the most creative uses of environmental storytelling and representations of the human psyche that you'll find in the medium, wrapped up in a 3D collectathon game that's pretty easy for anyone to enjoy. Even in a generation that was being overstuffed with this model of gameplay, Pyschonauts was able to cement itself as a beloved favorite. You know, a few years after it came out, because this game bombed at release, it made no money. Over time though, and through re-releases, it would become a cult classic, and after a very long and very turbulent process of getting this game to exist, 16 years later, Pyschonauts 2 came out. I've talked about this a little bit before on the channel, but I grew up on this style of game from the PS2 and Xbox and GameCube generation, so to see such an obscure gem from that time receive such a faithful follow-up just instantly makes me a little happy. I had never even played Pyschonauts until a few years ago, but when I did, it felt like freshly revisiting an old favorite I had experienced for ages, and Pyschonauts 2 gives off that exact same nostalgia. A little bit too well actually. Let's get this out of the way. If Pyschonauts 2 has one big problem, it's that it doesn't really evolve the weaker parts of the prior game. This is a pitfall that a lot of these tributes to damn near extinct genres fall into. We like them because they're delivering these classic nostalgic experiences, but there are some small parts of them here and there that could really benefit from updating with the times. You look at similar recent releases like Mario Odyssey or Hat in Time and see those small improvements or additions that weren't in the older games, and they go a long way forward. Now while Pyschonauts 2 doesn't really add a lot of these improvements, it doesn't really suffer too much from these old school problems either. For example, the platforming gameplay itself doesn't have any noticeable changes or improvements, but the level design for the platforming here is a lot better than the first game, and keeps the mechanics from feeling dated. The only area of gameplay that does feel dated is combat. I think the cool psychic powers keeps fighting from flat out sucking ass, but it still feels wonky and unsatisfying. They add a lot of variety in enemies and give each of your powers a use in combat, but deploying them and dispersing enemies just never leaves the impact it needs to. The most fun I have in combat isn't actually attacking itself, but waiting for my attack opportunities while juking out enemies on the ball or whittling their health away by shooting down at them. That part is pretty fun. Combat overall though, doesn't really. But that's fine, because combat's only really a smaller part of the gameplay. The platforming and exploring are what really make it up, and those both work great because the level and environmental design really empower the simple setup this gameplay works with, and those both work great because the story and characters here are really likable and charming, while being deep and complex, and those both work great because this game is great. You see, it's like a chain of greatness that works its way down. After the events of the first game and all the work he put in, our boy Raz is finally able to become a Psycho-Knight intern.
Congratulations.
He doesn't even have time to argue about his position because shit's kinda going down. The head of the Pyschonauts has been put into a comatose state, there's a mole within the organization that's working to resurrect an evil super psychic witch named Maligula, and worst of all, Raz's family is visiting. I don't want to spoil anything because the plot is actually a lot of fun and genuinely surprising in places, but most of it revolves around helping old potheads work through their mental breakdowns, traumas, usually and depressions. It's pretty great, but it's when you actually go into these people's minds, the actual levels of this game, where Pyschonauts gets really impressive. These characters' perceptions of the world, themselves, what they value, and how certain events within the story have drastically affected them, all that shapes the level design, the platforming, the blockades, and the objectives. Every one of these minds you go into have tons of character and complexity, but the actual main story and plot progression never dwells on them. Despite being such an integral part of what makes Pyschonauts, all this character building is mostly background information and story, but it's the delivery that makes it stick out naturally and effectively. I don't think a lot of people notice this, but this amount of storytelling and writing and lore is actually in so many other games. Not just big-ass confusing RPGs or primarily story-focused experiences. Like, even Fortnite's got a lot of story and lore to it. But this stuff is rarely ever cared about, and that's because so often, information that isn't serving the immediate story is left to collectibles, like books or audio logs or side conversations, which is fine, but also like, ew, fuck reading. While this is a natural way to stuff more story into a game, it also cements that stuff as just side info that most people will never really bother with. And that's where Pyschonauts is so brilliant. It shoves that story right in your face without overloading players with a barrage of talking or text, just with really good artistry and design. The themes of these levels are these infusions of what the characters value in life, along with what's causing their mental strain, and as you progress throughout, you can mostly piece together the story of these people's lives. It makes for really creative environments and concepts for gameplay. The enemies of the games are different ways in which the brain reacts to or tries to cope with their stresses. The objectives and end goals of the levels are usually resolutions, closure, or at least some kind of progress in the brain moving on. Even the collectibles play into this character building. There are hundreds of figments to collect in this game, those literally being figments of the brain's imagination, and looking at them can give you a real sense of the person's personality and values. You can find tags and link them to the appropriate emotional baggages that just sit around crying until you do. The most telling ones, however, are the memory vaults, which once opened show a little slideshow of important but repressed memories. What's weird about all of this, but also strengthening in a way, is that the tone of the game is always lighthearted and whimsical. It feels like something that would fit right in on a movie night on Cartoon Network, but all of this is actually dealing with some pretty heavy themes and messages. Like, they never downplay or mock mental health, the game is always considerate and tasteful about it, but the game never wallows in some of these pretty saddening moments. This is a positive of the game, by the way, it's just kind of an ironic one. Like, look at this place. You got this mellow little tune playing over these relaxing waves and beaches, like a fun island adventure. This is the most depressing level in the game, and I want to explain how a place this calm with these fun little bottle slides actually represents something so sad and miserable, without ever explicitly stating what's going on here. But this is really stuff you should just play through and see for yourself. This whole game is one you should just kind of go and experience for yourself, because they just don't make games like this anymore. Which, yeah, does come with its own negatives, but it's not a game that's only being held up by baiting nostalgia. It's just a game that's so easy to get into and like. You've got this not flawless, but really fun platforming and gameplay, a charming and thoughtful plot and cast of characters, and both of these combining to make these amazing levels that are just a trip to go through and learn about. For all of this, Pyschonauts 2 is greatly appreciated, and overall is pretty good. You'd be psycho not to give it a try.
Anybody know what time it is?
Oh shit, I just realized it's basically Persona 5 as a platformer.